my third lecture. Today I'm going to talk about the Japanese side of the story of the ending the Pacific War, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to talk about today. With introduction, I'm going to say a few words about introduction, and I'm going to go to the background and explain a little bit about the centrality of the Soviet Union that occupies in Japanese foreign and military policy, and I'm going to explain what kokutai means, because that's a very important concept. And then I'm going to zero in to the period from the Potsdam Conference to the end of the Pacific War, and then I want to talk about the Japanese reaction to the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, and the reaction to the Soviet entry into the war, and the emperor's interventions. I'm going to end with a few conclusions. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so first of all, yesterday and the day before yesterday, I explained the two assumptions on which that American historians, Americans in general, justify the dropping of the bomb. And yesterday, we concentrated on the first assumption, that is that the assumption that there's no alternative, but the invasion, costly invasion, or the atomic bomb was actually forced. There are basically about three alternatives. Today I'm going to talk about the second assumption, that is, it is the atomic bomb that ended the war. So this is in order to assess that second assumption, we have to go into the Japanese decision-making process. So that's what I'm going to talk about that. But in order to assess that the effects of the atomic bombs in Japan's decision to surrender, it's a very complicated process, because there's a first bomb on August 6th that is dropped on Hiroshima, right? And the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, 11 o'clock. But in between, the Soviet Union entered the war. And so disaggregate, separate all those three factors, it's somewhat difficult process. And so that the question that you have to ask is, well, what was the impact of the first bomb, Hiroshima bomb, right? And what was the impact of the Soviet entry into the war? And what was the impact of the two bombs combined, Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb, right? And so that's the way that we have to measure the impact of this bomb or the Soviet entry on the Japanese decision-making process. Now, I have to. So this is basically the major theme: the impact of atomic bomb and Soviet entry into the war on the Japanese decision to surrender. But closely connected with that issue, this is a sort of a second layer of the issue, is precisely the concept of kokutai. Kokutai. What is kokutai? I'm going to explain in a minute. But for the moment, let's say this is a concept closely related to the emperor system, right? And I'm going to explain more later on, because I think those two issues, that what made Japanese to surrender and the concept of kokutai are closely related. So those are two sort of themes that ran through my lecture. And then I'm not going to talk about the entire Pacific War. I'm going to concentrate on a period from July 27th to August 15th. July 27th is the day when the Japanese government, Japanese policy makers, learned of the Potsdam ultimatum. And August 15th is the day that the emperor had a broadcast, read the imperial rescript of the end of the war. And so that's the period, very concentrated period I'm going to talk about. Okay, now, a couple of things of a background. I'm going to talk about the centrality, as I mentioned, the centrality of the Soviet Union, Japan's military and foreign policy. And then second, I'm going to talk about Japanese concept of kokutai, that's centering around the emperor system for now, and I'm going to explain more closely later. That is, the kokutai is the notion that the policymakers consider the most important value. That is, this is the minimum condition that we have to maintain, preserve in order to end the war, right? So this is the so that the two things here. And then that I would like to say that the notion of kokutai actually changed during the crucial period from August 9th to the 15th. And it is very closely connected with Japanese decision to surrender. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to go back to 1941, where Japan and Russia, Japan and Soviet Union, have been sort of were arch enemies in Asia since 1890s. Those are two competing imperialist powers, and then they fought many wars. But 1941, they concluded the Neutrality Pact. Neutrality Pact. Japan concluded Neutrality Pact with the USSR in April 1941, April 26, 1941. That does not mean that suddenly the arch enemies became friends, right? They concluded Neutrality Pact for strategic reasons for both. Both wanted to avoid two-front war, because the Soviet Union already feeling that the war from Nazi Germany was imminent, right? And Japan was thinking about moving south, right? Moving south means the war with Western powers, particularly with the United States. And so Japan also wanted to avoid two-frontal war. And so both, this is obviously a marriage of convenience. So this is the, but they had no illusion. Both sides intended to wage war against the other as soon as the strategic need of neutrality is no longer required. Right? And so both sides needed neutrality, right? And then, but the fortunes of war during the Pacific War moved against Japan. 1942, the defeat of Midway, and then the Saipan fell, and so it was Japan that needed neutrality more than the Soviet Union. That's the way that development in the war moved, right? And then soon the Soviets, as long as they do not need, after the prospect of German defeat became clear to the Soviet leaders, particularly after the Battle of Stalingrad. So then Soviets began to prepare war against Japan. This is precisely the time when Japan desperately tried to attain Soviet neutrality. They tried to keep Soviet Union out of the war. Now, this is the picture of the April 26th, 1941. You know that Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister Matsuoka signing Neutrality Pact. Of course, that you know this one. Uncle Joe Stalin and overlooking Stalin and overlooking Foreign Minister Molotov, Commissar of Foreign Affairs Molotov. Probably you don't know who this guy is. Does anybody know? Probably nobody knows. This guy is called the Deputy Foreign Secretary of Lozovsky. That we're gonna talk about Lozovsky tomorrow. Anyway, so here this is the situation, and so. But in April 1945, the Soviet Union notified the Japanese government that it is no longer interested in renewing the Neutrality Pact. The one provision of Neutrality Pact is that unless the one party informed the other 1 year before the Neutrality Pact becomes is over, then the Neutrality Pact will be renewed automatically another 5 years. And therefore, April came, and it is the obligation of the Soviet Union to reform the Japanese government. They are no longer interested. So that they are going to abrogate Neutrality Pact, and that is obligated. But my opinion, why did they do that? Why did they do that? Isn't that sort of signal to the Japanese government that they are interested in waging a war against Japan? Sato asked, so what do you mean? That they're going to abrogate Neutrality Pact right away? And Molotov says, no, that the Neutrality Pact will be in force until, still in force until that full time is up, that April 1946. I'm going to talk about this more tomorrow, but this is precisely the Stalin later on says we are going to lull the Japanese to sleep. And we're going to let the Japanese believe that Neutrality Pact is in force, and in the cloak of neutrality, we are going to send troops and equipment to the Far East to prepare for the war. But it is precisely the time when the Japanese desperately tried to keep the Soviet Union out of war. Desperately, and then I would say foolishly, because this is a time when the Soviet Union is already determined to wage war against Japan. And the Japanese were sort of holding the last hope to terminate the war through to keep the Soviet Union out of war. Now, but this Japanese foolish move, I'm going to talk more detail about that. First, the former Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister Hirota approached Soviet Ambassador Malik and sounded out the possibility of renewing a Neutrality Pact. That went nowhere. And then later on, the Japanese government decided we are going to formally request Moscow's mediation to terminate the war. And then all those moves were exploited by Stalin to prolong the war. Remember, yesterday I talked about Yalta Agreement. Yalta Agreement, in order for Stalin or Soviet Union to get access to the war trophies that promised by FDR, Roosevelt, then Soviet Union had to enter the war. And they did not want the war to end until all the preparations were concluded. So this foolish sort of move of on the part of the Japanese government were exploited by the Soviet government to prolong the war. This is a major blunder on the part of Japan. Japan sort of substituted wishful thinking for very cold, calculated, or the rational thinking. And then you have to ask why. Why did Japan need Soviet neutrality so much, so badly, right? There are two reasons, military reasons and the political reasons. The military reason is this: the Japanese military already came to the conclusion, right? Conclusion that in order to terminate the war, they have to score at least one victory in order to gain the terms favorable to Japan. And so they put all the eggs into one major battle, the homeland defense on the Kyushu, right? And how did they do that? They are thinning all those Japanese troops from Manchuria and China and the Kuriles and sending to Kyushu, okay? So that means it is very military speaking from the military point of view. This strategy, form of defense is called Ketsugo. Right? And they are desperate final defense against the United States, expected United States invasion on the Kyushu, and then we're going to terminate the war. And then for that strategy to work, then this is Soviet neutrality is essential, because you cannot fight two-front war, and as long as Soviet Union invade Manchuria, there's no way that you can defend. And so defend Manchuria, and the Soviet Union would move south, and not only Manchuria, but also on the Sakhalin, the Kuriles, and eventually Hokkaido. And so this is, therefore, the Soviet neutrality was a very essential condition for the Ketsugo strategy to work. So that's for military reasons. Therefore, military was pushing the civilian government to get the neutrality. So it's very important to gain that assurance the Soviet Union would stay out of the war. Yeah, another political reasons. Political reason is this, precisely this unconditional surrender that the United States government demanding. The Japanese policymakers consider this is not acceptable. Why is not acceptable? Because unconditional surrender, they interpreted, is the attempt to destroy the kokutai, that is the emperor system. Right? This is the emperor system. And so, and I'm going to explain then, what is this kokutai then, right? And so, what choice did they have? As long as the United States demanded unconditional surrender, that they are not, the Japanese policymakers are going to directly negotiate with the United States, right? And so, the only possibility they found is the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is the only great power that remained neutral. And so they decided, I would say, probably in retrospect, very foolishly, they decided to approach Moscow to terminate the war. Right? This is the background. So this is, they thought that through Soviet Union, that they might be able to negotiate to preserve the kokutai right? That's the system, the concept that they thought the most important. Now, then come to the question, what is kokutai then? It is very interesting. After the war, Naval Chief of Staff Toyoda Suemu wrote in a little article in which he said, you know, we always talk about kokutai, 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 but we really didn't know exactly what it meant specifically. What it meant specifically then the kokutai. What is kokutai then, right? Well, I tell you, there are basically three concepts emerged. Actually, the first concept of kokutai is a prevailing view notion. That's a very mythical notion of the kokutai. That is the Japanese, this is kokutai that centered around emperor worship, right? Emperor worship. That transcends any legal system. This is essence of Japan. Essence, very mythical, sort of religious essence, spiritual essence. In 1936, Ministry of Education published a little pamphlet called Essence of Kokutai, in which he said the emperor is a living God. Living God is the eternal essence of his subjects and the imperial land, right? And that defies any, that transcends any legal definition. This is essence of Japan. And in fact, that this is, and so the Japanese government, since the Meiji Restoration, they indoctrinated all the Japanese subjects with this imperial worship. And you know that if you go to get conscripted, you are into the army. The first thing you have to do is to memorize the imperial rescript of to the soldiers and sailors, and you have to memorize all the time. If you go to school, you have to memorize. All the school children have to memorize that imperial rescript in education, right? And so that this is really the Japanese are integrated with the imperial worship. It's very important to understand. It's so fun, you know. Fanaticism was such that during the war, every school has this little shrine, right? Little shrine in which the emperor's picture is displayed, right? And it is the responsibility of the principal and of the teachers to protect that picture, just a piece of picture, right? From anything. If they're burned, then that's the first obligation, is to protect that picture, rather than say safety of the children. And this is the degree of fanaticism that they reached in Japan. And so that's the prevailing view, actually, of this of the notion of kokutai, right? Now, there's no way that the United States would accept that concept of kokutai, because they thought they are fighting against Japanese militarism, right? Japanese militarism. They thought that we have to eradicate Japanese militarism. And this kind of notion, mythical notion of kokutai, is precisely the reason why that militarism still persists. And there's no way that in that kind of a kokutai, the Japanese policymakers insist on the preservation of this notion, kokutai, right? There's no way that the United States would accept. So that's the prevailing view. But there are a small group of people who are working towards the termination of war, started studying that how to define the notion of kokutai so that we can preserve some kind of it's kind of emperor system in such a way that the United States and the Western allies could accept. And they came up with two alternatives. First alternative is that to limit the emperor's power to politics, political power of emperor, and to define the emperor power in a constitutional legal way. Actually, this is a kind of notion that was presented by a constitutional lawyer, constitutional scholar of Tokyo University back in 1930s. It's called Emperor as an Organ of the State. And this was viciously attacked by fanatic ultra nationalists. And he was forced to resign. Right? And henceforward, this fanatic notion of mystic notion of kokutai became a predominant current. But although small group of people, hey, this is probably one way that we can preserve some kind of emperor system, kokutai. Right? Another possibility is a narrowest definition of kokutai. That's the imperial house. Imperial house, that unbroken lineage of imperial house from the mythical first emperor Jimmu. This is the proud imperial, Japanese imperial tradition, okay, throughout centuries. And this is imperial house. This is probably, maybe we can, at least we can preserve that imperial house. And the second notion will be probably acceptable to the United States. In fact, you saw, we explained yesterday, Stimson's draft. Okay, we allowed the Japanese the possibility of maintaining constitutional monarchy under the current dynasty, right? And so that depending on how the emperor's power is defined by constitution, I think that might be acceptable. But third, the narrowest definition is totally acceptable to the United States, particularly. In fact, that's precisely what the occupation forces did. They didn't abolish imperial house, right? And so those are the three notions. But the prevailing view is the first mythic notion, right? So this is the kokutai. Now, by June 1945, the Japanese policymakers, including the military, came to the conclusion there's no way that you can win the war, and therefore that you have to seek the ways to terminate the war, particularly after the defeat of the Battle of Okinawa. Well, up until then, the emperor himself thought that one more battle, we can score a victory in Okinawa, and then we can terminate the war. But after the defeat of Battle of Okinawa, the emperor himself came around to accept the notion that we have to terminate the war. But the Japanese policymakers are hopelessly divided between Peace Party and the War Party. Peace Party thought that it is necessary to terminate the war, sooner the better. And the War Party insisted, again, one more victory, right, to terminate the war. You know, the United States might have a very massive technological power. They're spiritually weak. The United States are chicken. They don't want to fight. You know, Japanese, we have a Yamato spirit. We are fighting. You know, we are not afraid of death. They can come to Japanese land. We can score victory. We can just demolish the morale of the American soldiers, and then we can dictate. We can at least negotiate with Americans for better terms. And so the highest organ of the decision-making body in Japan is called the Supreme War Council. That's called the Big Six. That is Prime Minister, his name is Suzuki, Foreign Minister, Foreign Minister Togo, Navy Minister Yonai, right? And then three hawks, right? The Army Minister Anami, right? And the Army Chief of Staff and Navy Chief of Staff. So the 3 and 3, they are hopelessly divided. How could that, divided and they're stalemated? Stalemated. The peculiarity of Japanese political system is such that, so stalemated, why couldn't the emperor intervene to just break the stalemate, right? But that's not the tradition. Emperor is supposed to be outside politics. Emperor is a figurehead. Traditionally, he can only approve the decisions made by the cabinet, right? But the cabinet or the Supreme War Council is hopelessly divided. How could the Japanese government make a decision? This is a dysfunctional system, right? And so Japanese could not come to terms with a decision. Now, however, there's one thing that both parties agreed. That is that unconditional surrender cannot be accepted. Because unconditional surrender, they interpreted, is a destruction. That meant they intend to destroy Japanese kokutai, right? And so they could not accept. And so what's the alternative? Alternative is to seek Moscow's mediation to terminate the war. And this is the background. We talked about Prime Minister Togo's telegram to Ambassador Sato on July 12th. This is the first time Togo sent a telegram to Sato, please, trying to make arrangement to seek the appointment with the highest authority, probably Foreign Minister Molotov, so that Soviet government would accept the emperor's special envoy, Prince Konoe, to terminate the war. And then Foreign Minister Togo added, but we are interested, well, the emperor said, we're interested for eternal peace of the world, to terminate the war. But if the United States or the Western powers insist on unconditional surrender, then we have no choice but to fight to the last man, right? Because we have to preserve kokutai. Now, so this is the background, right? And that's a couple of days, 5 days before Potsdam Conference began, this the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister Togo sent that very famous telegram. And then you know that already from yesterday's lecture that Truman deleted or crossed out that constitutional, the provision number Potsdam, the Stimson's draft 12, the provision allowing Japanese to maintain that constitutional monarchy. Now, Japan learned about the Potsdam Ultimatum on July 27th. As I said, it's not official diplomatic document. It was broadcast from the San Francisco shortwave radio. And as I said before, right, this is not diplomatic document, and there's no provision about the deadline. We brook no delay. That's what it says. But if you do not surrender, if you don't accept those terms, then the utter destruction is a you have to prepare for the utter destruction of Japanese land. Now, Japanese government, Japanese policymakers noticed immediately two things. One, of course, the Potsdam Ultimatum did not contain anything that they were most interested in. That is the fate of the emperor system and the fate of the emperor, right? Because that the possibility of maintaining constitutional monarchy under the current dynasty, that provision was taken out by Truman, right? And so they know this. They didn't say anything about that. That's the most vitally the policymakers are interested in. Secondly, Stalin didn't sign. And what was Japan's policy before that? Japan's policy before that was to seek the termination of the war through Moscow's mediation. Therefore, that you can imagine if you're a Japanese policymaker, then we're going to continue that policy because we haven't received any definite answer from Moscow. Right? So this is what happened. Foreign Minister Togo noticed the Potsdam Ultimatum was somewhat milder than the ultimatum that had been issued to Germany, because this is the ultimatum that you saw. Instead of unconditional surrender, it says unconditional surrender of armed forces. Right? And so he scratched his head and says, well, probably it's milder. Probably I think we have to clarify those things. And clarify things, but clarify things where? Through Moscow mediation. Right? Through Moscow, we can clarify those things, and we can discuss the terms. And therefore, that of course, obviously, that no provision, no ultimatum that included anything about the emperor, the fate of emperor and emperor system. Of course, they could not accept. But there is some kind of room for negotiation. That's what I thought. Togo thought that it is better to publish the entire ultimatum without any comments. Well, you have to publish it because you cannot suppress it because the shortwave radio and the Japanese people are familiar with the contents, right? However, the military objected. Military opposed the publication without comments. It says this is the propaganda, U.S. propaganda. This will affect the morale of the soldiers, and therefore we have to protest. We have to do something. And so they had a secret. They had a meeting of the military meeting, invited Suzuki, and then the outcome of this military is that Suzuki held a press conference in which he responded to the judgment. The Japanese government would mokusatsu the Potsdam ultimatum. Now, mokusatsu, probably Frederick will know what it means, right? Mokusatsu literally means silently kill, right? But mokusatsu is not really outright rejection. Mokusatsu means I'm going to mokusatsu. I'm going to just ignore it. To put it, I mean, that negotiation. So the Japanese government trying to negotiate with Moscow, and Potsdam Declaration said didn't say anything about the emperor. So we are going to suspend that judgment, right? That mokusatsu statement is very unfortunate because this is a statement interpreted by Truman and the U.S. government as a rejection of the Potsdam terms. In fact, probably Truman and Burns, they expected Japanese to reject that, and then that became the very good excuse for the United States to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. Now, behind this scene, there is the debate between Ambassador Sato and Foreign Minister Togo. Sato was a very, very able diplomat, very clear thinking. And he was very skeptical about the Japanese move to approach Moscow. He says, there's no way that Moscow would accept Japanese request for mediation. After all, long protracted negotiations with the former Prime Minister, Foreign Minister Hirota, Moscow didn't budge, and why Moscow's position is much better now. So there's no way that Moscow would accept Japanese request. In fact, this is after Potsdam conference, and he suspected there must be some kind of agreement between the Soviet Union and the Allies. And this is foolish to expect for Japanese government the Soviet government to work for the termination of the war, right? And then Sato advised Foreign Minister, the best way is now it's pressing need to terminate the war, accept the Potsdam terms, with only one condition: the preservation of the imperial house. That's the very narrowest definition of the Koktai, right? And so we can preserve Koktai, and then the rest of it we can terminate the war. Now, think about it. Think about Stimson's draft, right? This is the United States is prepared to accept the preservation of constitutional monarchy under the current dynasty, right? And this is so that there is sort of room of agreement between the United States, at least Stimson, and the Japanese government, right? What's Togo's opposition? Togo's position. Togo's August 7th, Togo responded to Sato's. You don't understand the complication of domestic situation. I had to deal with the military, right? It is very, very difficult. You cannot really accept Potsdam terms immediately, right? But he says, I am prepared to go to Moscow, right? And I intend to use the Potsdam terms as a basis of negotiation. And through that negotiation, probably we can come up with the preservation of the imperial house, and then come back to Japan and impose that conditions on the military. That's his scenario, right? In other words, the Japanese government, and as of August 2nd, was prepared to accept the Potsdam terms as a basis of negotiation. And that Sato-Togo exchange, of course, was captured by the the eavesdropping method, and it was quite and therefore the U.S. policymakers were quite familiar with the contents of the exchange. However, already the train that decided to drop the bomb was moving, and they did not pay much attention to that Togo's reply, despite the fact that the Japanese government was prepared to negotiate in terms of on the basis of or post-term terms. So that you can see the counterfactual is that suppose had the United States issued ultimatum, post-term ultimatum, maintaining Stimson's original provision, the possibility of allowing the Japanese government to maintain that constitutional monarchy under the current dynasty. Of course, there's no guarantee. Then the situation might have been different. The military probably still might have opposed, and yet the correlation of forces between the military and those people who, the peace party, surrounding the emperor, right, might have changed in favor of the peace party. And this is, and then the war party's power might have been very severely weakened, because I think this is, now there's one possibility that we can maintain. We can maintain Kokutai, we can maintain preservation, the imperial army, imperial house. Now, if it is combined with Stalin's signature, signaling to Japan that, hey, you're hoping the mediation and Soviet from Moscow. Moscow is with us, with allies. Then I think that would have been tremendous shock to the Japanese policymakers, and therefore that there might have been some early termination of the war without dropping the bomb. So, but nevertheless, the United States decided to drop the bomb, and again, the first atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima on August 6th. It was followed, but August Hiroshima bomb did not immediately prompt Japanese government to sue for peace. And midnight of August 9th, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. And August 9th, about 11 o'clock, the second bomb, atomic bomb, was dropped on Nagasaki. And so, first, let's talk about the impact of Hiroshima bomb. After the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, Japanese knew that immediately. Well, by the evening, or by the afternoon, the Japanese knew that this is atomic bomb. Well, in the first place, Truman announced it as atomic bomb, broadcast atomic bomb, and the Japanese scientists also, the physicists who are familiar with nuclear physicists, immediately realized that this is atomic bomb. How did the Japanese government react to the first atomic bomb? The highest decision-making body, Supreme War Council, was not convened, even after the Hiroshima bomb. The cabinet was convened. Cabinet meeting was convened on August 6th, sometime in the afternoon. And they decided, we are not going to announce that this is an atomic bomb. We are going to announce to the Japanese this is new type of bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, new type of bomb. And then decided to send the investigating team, headed by a military man and also including nuclear physicist, to Hiroshima. There's a debate as to whether Togo advocated the acceptance post-term terms at this meeting. But it is clear the cabinet did not accept, if he made such an argument, did not accept his insistence on post-term terms, accepting post-term terms. And in fact, the cabinet did not talk about termination of the war. Most important thing is that after the Hiroshima bomb, Prime Minister Togo sent an urgent telegram to Sato on August 7th, urging him to obtain an appointment in Moscow. He said, situation is so pressing, urgent. Obviously, atomic bomb had an impact, right? I'm not denying that the impact of the Hiroshima bomb, that is tremendous. It's a shock to the Japanese government, right? It's urgent, situation urgent. Therefore, that it's very necessary to obtain appointment with Moscow so that we can terminate the war. And then Sato sent telegram back, right? Telegram back. In other words, here Togo's August 7th telegram explains this means the Japanese government essentially did not change the policy to seek Soviet mediation. Still hanging on this last hope that the Moscow will be the last hope to terminate the war. Okay. And then the Japanese government received Sato's telegram. Finally, we got appointment, with Molotov. Molotov came back from Potsdam and then asked me to come to the foreign ministry, this commissariat of foreign affairs, tomorrow, August 8th. And so all the eyes of Japanese policymakers just watching what Molotov would say. Now, and so Molotov summoned Sato at 5 p.m. on August 8th. Originally, it was scheduled at 6 o'clock, and it was changed to 5. It's the difference between the two. I'm going to explain. Big difference. And then Sato came, and then, started with pleasantry. Well, I'm glad that he came back safely from Potsdam and so on. And Molotov says, wait, do not say a word because I have some very important document to read. Sit down. And they proceeded to read Soviet declaration of war against Japan. He said, the Soviet allies had asked the Soviet Union to join the joint ultimatum, which they did not. Right? This is right because the Truman and Burns just rejected, right, to give their signature, and then this joint ultimatum was rejected by the Japanese government. Well, Truman said that it was rejected, and Soviet government repeated the Japanese government. And therefore, the Soviet Union finds itself in a state of war as of the midnight of August 9th. And then, of course, Sato, although he was a very capable diplomat, did not expect this. And repeated, and he said, repeated, asks that declaration of war again. And then he asked, okay, do I have a permission to send a telegram to home government? And Molotov said, by all means, do it. But less than 1 hour, Soviet tanks and airplanes crossed the border to Manchuria. Sato made a mistake because the midnight of August 9th, in the Far Eastern time, Chita time, was 6 o'clock in Moscow time. and then the state of war or the telegraphic, that's closed, right? And so here the Soviet Union entered a war against Japan. What was Japan's reaction to the Soviet entry into the war? After the Hiroshima was bombed by atomic bomb, the Supreme War Council was not held. Now, after the Soviet entered into the war, Supreme War Council was immediately summoned on the morning of August 9th. And there, the subject, it was accepted that we have to terminate the war. Terminate the war, we have to surrender terms. We have to terminate the war, okay? The cabinet meeting and then after Hiroshima, they did not discuss the termination of war. They accepted, they took it for granted to continue the war. But now that we have to terminate the war, the discussion, but it was Supreme War Council hopelessly divided again, the war party, and then peace party. But this time, the division was what terms we are going to attach to accept Potsdam terms. And Togo insisted we should just have only one condition, that is preservation of Koktai, right? And the war party insisted 3 other conditions. That is, in addition to Koktai, we have to attach no Allied occupation would happen in Japan, and no war trial will be conducted by the Allies, and the disarmament will be done by the Japanese forces. Okay, now it's war trial will be conducted by Japanese forces by themselves, because I think they are concerned about the Allied would bring the emperor into war trial, right? And about the disarmament was concerned, because I think the tradition of Japanese soldiers, they are not going to the sword, right? And those the weapons, they are spiritual thing. They are not going to surrender. And so those are 3 conditions. I mean, 4 conditions. Therefore, 4 conditions and then 1 condition. Peace party insisted this. If you attach those 3 other additional conditions, there's no way that the United States would accept it. And we are not going to terminate the war. Be serious, okay? So, but they could not determine that, again, Supreme War Council was totally stalemated. And so one more thing that we have to remember here, this is the notion of Koktai. Togo skillfully slipped into this Koktai. He says, Koktai, that is preservation imperial house. Imperial house. It's the narrowest definition of Koktai. I think this is the only thing that the Allies would accept. Most of the participants in the War Council, there was so heated discussion between either one condition or 4 conditions. They did not pay attention to these very subtle differences, right? But anyway, so the Supreme War Council was hopelessly divided. The Prime Minister went to the Lord Keeper of Imperial Seal, Marquis Kido. Kido is a sort of very emperor's trusted advisor. You can say the emperor's the Kido reflected emperor's opinion. But before that, in the middle of this heated discussion, news of the second bomb, Nagasaki, reached the Supreme War Council. Did it affect the outcome of this decision? No. There's no discernible impact of Nagasaki bomb. In fact, at the imperial headquarters had official record. Okay, official record said there is no record to indicate that the Nagasaki bomb has any influence on the decision. And so the Prime Minister Suzuki brought that outcome of the Supreme War Council to Marquis Kido. Kido was, in the beginning, willing to accept 4 conditions. And that surprised all the peace party, because 4 conditions, that means that there's a continuation of war. There's no way that the United States accept war conditions. And so that there's a strong pressure from war party, former Prime Minister, from Foreign Minister Shigemitsu and others. War party just worked behind the scenes to persuade Kido's opinion. And there's a very important meeting between Kido and the emperor that lasted 45 minutes. Usually Kido and emperor's meeting, just 5 minutes, 10 minutes, did not last for 45 minutes. Right? There's no record on this. But I think there that I speculated, I was a sort of provocateur, there's no document. And then the Japanese historians are not willing to touch on the emperor's role, emperor's detailed role, and then there must be some record in the imperial household. And so I'm a provocateur. I said, here, this is important. This must be the place where the emperor and the Kido discussed how to proceed with this. My guess is that the emperor accepted, rather than 4 conditions, 1 condition. 1 condition, my speculation, without evidence, is that the emperor did not accept Togo's narrowest definition of imperial, preservation of imperial. He expanded a little bit and insisted on the political role of emperor's political role. That is the second option, second notion, right? And so, but the emperor accepted, okay, it is a stalemate. We are going to do, and then peace party encouraged Kido and the emperor to take this position because it is stalemate. Supreme War Council stalemate. This is the only way to break the stalemate is for the emperor to take unprecedented decision to intervene, right? And voice his opinion, the sacred voice, and impose that imperial voice onto the government. And so, unprecedented imperial conference was held after 11 o'clock on August 9th, and lasting in early hours of August 10th. And so the Imperial Conference was held, and those people who are Supreme War Council members appeared in Imperial Conference. There's a text, draft of the acceptance post-term terms with only 1 condition: emperor's rule under national law. That is the second. The emperor represents the organ of the state under national law, right? Under that condition, with 1 condition, Japanese would accept the post-term terms. Again, the 3 hawks opposed, insisted on continuation of war. and 3 supported Togo's statement. Right? But, surprise, surprise, there's a surprise because the Peace Party invited the chairman of the Privy Council. His name is a very old man, almost very close to 80. He's a Hiranuma, former Prime Minister Hiranuma. He's an ultra nationalist. He's the one who spearheaded the attack on the constitutional lawyer, right? Who had advocated the emperor as the organ theory in 1930s. And he says, of course, he could not accept this emperor's rule, emperor's political rule under national law, because that's a totally, he was totally against this kind of, because emperor transcends law. Emperor is the essence of Japan, right? And so he offered an amendment, in fact, arguing the first prevailing notion of kokutai, that is mythical notion, essence, emperor's essence of Japan, right? And therefore that we accept the Potsdam terms, but acceptance of this demand would not prejudice prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. In fact, what he did was to make that condition unacceptable to the United States government, because there's no way the United States would accept that, because the United States is fighting to eradicate Japanese militarism, and this is the source of militarism, right? And so, but that was a prevailing notion of the kokutai. And then nobody, including the emperor, could raise objections to this amendment. And so, in the end, what happened was the emperor's sacred decision. Sacred decision is that we are going to accept Potsdam Declaration with amendment offered by Hiranuma. And so, this is the sacred decision that's imposed on the Japanese government Supreme Council, and this decision was relayed to the Swiss government, and this is the one that was relayed to the United States. Now, what was the reaction of the United States? Of course, the Japanese specialists were alarmed by this provision, because this is the mythical notion that's maintained, the mythical notion of kokutai, and we cannot accept this, because this is, we are not going to eradicate the source of militarism. And so the United States government discussed this, and one Stimson's assistant McCloy said, okay. McCloy says, well, at least we can send a signal to Japan that constitutional, that they can maintain constitutional monarchy. And Burns, Secretary of State Burns, vetoed this, rejected this, because it's very, very important. Japanese had the audacity to attach conditions. We are not going to accept their conditions. We have to bring the Japanese to its knees. Unconditional surrender, there's no question. And so, Burns composed so-called Burns Note, reply to Japanese conditional acceptance of the Potsdam terms. And Burns' note stated, Article 1, that the emperor is subject to supreme commander of allied powers. Emperor is subject to MacArthur, right? And the number 4 says the form of government will be determined by the Japanese people. Whether the emperor system will be preserved or not will be determined by the Japanese people. This is more or less the provision that was left in the Potsdam Declaration, Potsdam Ultimatum. And so that was relayed to the Japanese government. This Burns note immediately invited backlash, because this is, I mean, heavens forbid, the emperor subject to MacArthur? This is totally alien to the notion, those people who are living in the mythical notion of kokutai, right? And a form of government to be determined. People's voice, my gosh, kokutai is totally alien to democracy. The people's voice is not very important. What is very important is the emperor's voice, right? And so those people who are fanatic believer of kokutai were really up in arms against this Burns. No, we have to fight this. There's no way to accept this, and we have to fight the war to the very, very bitter end. Even some of the peace parties advocate Prime Minister Suzuki and Navy Minister Yonai, their determination wavered, right? But the peace party, who are second-tier peace party who worked very strenuously behind the scenes, convinced Kido, and the emperor himself played a very important role here. Emperor is also fighting for the survival of himself and his imperial house. If we lose the chance, then what is going to happen? And so they decided the peace party hatched a conspiracy to have a second imperial conference. Right? So, second imperial conference, behind the back of the peace party, in fact, the peace party tricked the military. Imperial conference was held. Again, this is August 14th. August 14th, and then there, the emperor had a second sacred decision. He says, I have heard your opinions, but I myself decided to accept Potsdam terms unconditionally and to terminate the war. And here in this decision, that I would argue the Soviet factor is very important, because some of the argument that is made by peace party says, if you miss this chance, what's going to happen? Soviet had invaded. Soviet had moving very fast in Manchuria. Soviet Red Army would move in Sakhalin, move in the Kurils, and eventually they might occupy Hokkaido. And they might insinuate themselves in the occupational forces. In that case, the fate of imperial house will become very precarious. And therefore, the emperor said, Burns says number 4 says, the form of government will be determined by the Japanese people. And so I will gamble on this. And they will gamble on Americans rather than seeing the Japanese land occupied by the Soviet Union. And they gamble, you know what happened with the occupation of MacArthur's forces, preserved the imperial house. Right? They gambled on the right side. And so the policy makers gambled on Article 4 of the Burns notes. But it's a very, very precarious thing, because the young radical officers revolted, occupied the imperial palace. Occupied the imperial palace. Imperial palace was occupied. And they are quite capture the emperor right? And then they are prepared to have a martial law and killing off those traitors like a Kido and Togo and all those guys stage a coup d'etat. They counted on the support of Army Minister Anami. Anami is conflicted. He was a very firm believer of this Kokutai, fanatical belief in Kokutai, and he sympathized with the young officers. And yet, he was conflicted because his loyalty to emperor. But other high command of the army moved very, very quickly to rally behind the emperor's decision, right? And they branded those rebels as a rebel. They revolted against the emperor's decision. Anami himself committed suicide, ritual harakiri. And then with Anami, the imperial army perished. And then the dawn of bright sun of August 15th shined in Tokyo, and then emperor broadcasted the imperial rescript of the end of the war, claiming the Kokutai was preserved. And then this is what they said, the imperial rescript ending the war. It's a very strange document. If you take a look at the imperial rescript, the ending war, there's no mention of defeat or surrender. We Japanese call shusen. That's end of the war, not haisen, right? Or the defeat of the war, or the surrender, kofuku. So there's no word of mention defeat or surrender. And also, this imperial rescript is very characteristic of by the fact that there's no sense of responsibility that the Japanese caused in the war. He says, we declare the war against the United States and Britain to ensure Japan's self-preservation. And he said, we had no intention. That our intention was far from our thought either to infringe upon the sovereignty of other nations or to embark upon territorial aggrandizement. Well, tell it to the Chinese, right? And no remorse, and it is very, very strange document. And as for the reasons of war, he said the enemy had employed a very cruel bomb. The enemy has begun to employ a new and a most cruel bomb, and referring to atomic bomb, of course. And so that those people who argue that atomic bomb was a really decisive weapon, they just pointing out, hey, here, the emperor rescript. Here, it says refer to atomic bomb, but no reference to Soviet entry into the war. And so the atomic bomb was more decisive. And yet, if you take a look at this, he had this passage, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, where the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. It is an oblique reference to the Soviet entry into the war. By the way, this is not only the one imperial rescript that the emperor emperor issued in August, but 2 days later, he issued another rescript, an imperial rescript to the soldiers and sailors, in which, it's very strangely, he made no reference to the atomic bomb, only to the Soviet entry into the war. And then finally, this broadcasting, it says, having been able to safeguard and maintain the Kokutai, we decided to end the war. Well, how on earth does he know that? Did he know that he can maintain the imperial house? I mean, Kokutai, right? Because that's really up to the supreme commander, right? But this is the pretension, fiction that he made. We maintain Kokutai, managed to maintain Kokutai, therefore we ended the war. So that this is the message to the Japanese people, particularly the soldiers, sailors, that we maintain Kokutai, right? This is a fiction. So, what does all those things, what do all those things mean? That if you say, well, you can say that neither the atomic bombs of the nor the Soviet entry was a really decisive knockout punch, because it did not immediately lead to Japan's surrender, right? I mean, after August 6th, August 6th and August 15th, right? Almost 9 days after the atomic bomb, Hiroshima, and August 9th to 15th, about 6 days after Soviet entry, and then and a Nagasaki bomb. However, that if you compare the influence of the atomic bombs, not only Hiroshima bomb, but 2 bombs combined, and the Soviet entry, in my mind, there's no question that Soviet entry into the war had a far more, much stronger influence on the Japanese decision to surrender, because it dashed Japan's last hope to terminate the war through Moscow's mediation. And also, it destroyed Japan's military plan to defend homeland. The most crucial factor for Japan's decision was the emperor's intervention, because without emperor's intervention, sacred decision, Japan would not have been able to end the war. That's very important. But for that, I would argue the Soviet factor is very crucial too. Japanese policymakers feared the expansion of Soviet influence. In fact, they were quite right in fearing their impact, because I think Stalin demanded that Tokyo will be divided into occupational zones, right? And Stalin demanded that Hokkaido will be halved between American zone and the Soviet zone, right? And in that Soviet expansion influence, the fate of imperial house will become very precarious. And so that here, the Soviet factor also is very, very important. And therefore that I would say that it is compared with, of course, the atomic bomb had impact. I think that impact, in a sense, that Japanese policymakers, it injected urgency to terminate the war. But it is compared with atomic bomb, Soviet entry into the war had a more powerful influence on the Japanese decision to surrender. I would argue there existed hierarchy of values. Unfortunately, Japanese policymakers did not put the sacrifices, lives of Japanese people on the top of the hierarchy. Rather than that, they put preservation of Kokutai, whatever it meant. That's the highest value, right? And without that, they are willing to sacrifice Japanese people like a crushed jewel, okay, the millions are going to die for the emperor. And here is the false assumption on the part of the United States that if you inflict damage on civilians, unacceptable damage on the civilians, probably no government would, any government to accept surrender. This is what Americans think, right? But that's not the way the Japanese thought. And this is very important to think about what the hierarchy values of the Japanese policymakers. It's sad, but that's the fact. And then throughout this crucial moment, the concept of kokutai changed from mythical notion and to the very narrowest notion, preservation of the imperial house. That means the transformation of the emperor from the living god to human emperor. That it is accepted that Ningen Tenno, human emperor, took place only under MacArthur's occupation, when the emperor came to see MacArthur, and that was the moment when a human emperor was born. But I think I would argue that that transformation took place during that crucial moment of surrender decision. But on all those things, we have to really point out the Japanese responsibility. Japanese political system was dysfunctional to the extent that they could not decide on a termination of war. There are a number of occasions where Japan could have terminated the war. In May, when Germany capitulated, surrendered, the Japanese could have said, okay, the game's over. We end the war. When the Potsdam ultimatum was issued, they could have signaled to the United States. They did not. Right? And so those are missed chances. Hiroshima, even Hiroshima bomb was dropped, and they could have accepted surrender right then. In that case, they could have prevented Soviet entry into the war and the second bomb. And those things, I think Japan is responsible for inviting the atomic bomb and inviting the Soviet entry into the war. And therefore, that it makes me wonder why Japanese think about their victimization. We are also victims of war. We are the only ones who suffered the atomic bombs. And we suffered, the Soviets took the land that belonged to us. Oh, hell. My goodness. They could have prevented those things had they made that right decision before. And then therefore, the ultimate, I would say the Japanese responsibility is a really grave. So I end up here, and then I would just be willing to answer your questions.
Well, I will say at the onset, I'm not at all a specialist of Japanese history, but I wonder, because you speak about the Japanese, and then we discuss here mainly the elite, so the people at the military levels, the politicians, etc. We see that they were quite equally divided between the peace party and the war party. And did it reflect also the opinion of the Japanese? Are there studies, like in Nazi Germany, you know that there were studies from the bottom to reflecting what the people were thinking about the war, and in the last year, what was the state of the Japanese opinion?
Yeah.
Are there studies on these topics?
Okay, the question is that how about the Japanese, ordinary Japanese people thought about the whole thing? Well, Japanese, you know, it is very interesting, but when Tokyo was bombed by incendiary bombs in March 9th and 10th, the emperor had an inspection tour, and he was struck by the sudden faces, almost, well, I would not say hostility, but the lack of appreciation that the emperor is surveying this. So we suffer this. And so here that the Japanese people were, of course, they wanted the war to end. And yet, I think it will be a mistake to say that therefore that the Japanese people will be resentful of the emperor, because I think that Japanese people are thoroughly indoctrinated by this Japanese emperor worship. And then you know that when wars ended, there's a big square in front of Imperial Palace. Many Japanese came and then just bowed to the emperor's decision. And the emperor was quite savvy in wise to think the Japanese people would not abolish the imperial palace. And but still, that with that, and therefore that the defeat of the war would really result in a revolt against the emperor. I don't think that would have happened. Still, I think there's a very strong sort of claim for peace, and then and so on. That I remember. I tell you my personal reminiscence. I was born 1941, so that when the war was over, that I was 4 years old, I was evacuated from Tokyo, and in a countryside. My grandfather was a village chief, and he was the only one who had a radio, and so that all those villagers gathered in my grandfather's place and listened to the imperial rescript. And I remember that of course, I could not understand what he said. Most Japanese could not understand what he said because very archaic language. The only thing they understood was that the war was over. War was over, and then I remember that my adults suddenly crying, and so that's. But I could tell you, it does not cry from joy, but cry was sadness. The war's over, and then relief of the end of the war just came afterwards. And then the best book to read that how the Japanese embrace defeat is the one that John Dower's book called Embracing Defeat. It's a very there's a bitterness, a certain bitterness. I can tell you that my uncle was a student, and he was drafted, and he fought. He was sent to Manchuria, and he was captured by the Soviet, and he was one of those people who did not like Soviet, and so he was stayed into the Soviet Union until the very end. And he came back. He was not really politically radical, but his resentment to the emperor was very, very fierce. He says he did not even call emperor. He says Tenchan. It's just like a very sort of derogatory term that he referred to the emperor. So there's, after this, suffering from, there's all kinds of people, and then and there's all kinds of memories, memoirs written about how that they welcomed or they heard that emperor's broadcast. But I think to answer your question, I don't think that there's any sort of hostility against the emperor. Any other questions?
Can I maybe pick up on this question?
Yeah, sure.
And ask what you think the Japanese population expected from defeat and occupation. We know that the German population did not surrender and did not rebel because Nazi propaganda had created such apocalyptic expectations that the Soviets would kill them and massacre them and commit crimes on the scale which the Nazis committed crimes on the Eastern Front. What did the Japanese expect? I guess that atrocities committed by the Americans on Japanese POWs and propaganda must have created expectations of a terrible revenge that would touch all Japanese, and maybe anything would be better than to surrender. What were popular expectations of the day after and of especially American or Soviet occupation?
It's the military had this propaganda machine. It published this what to be expected from occupation, and the Japanese race will be annihilated, and Japanese male will be castrated, and that sort of thing. And it was disproven because I think that the Americans have very, 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 very effective propaganda. So saying that that's not it's going to happen. Potsdam Proclamation says we don't aim to destroy Japanese nation. You can go back to the peaceful life, right? And yet, I think this is true. The same type of propaganda was perpetrated because the Americans will come, and then also rape women, and so that the women should not appear when GIs come. But it is the Americans behave themselves very well. Not the Soviet Red Armies who just went to Germany and raped all women. Where there are certain isolated cases of GIs, raping the Japanese women. But I think Americans behave very, very well and very disciplined. And MacArthur's army came. MacArthur's army came, and then from Yokohama to Yugoslavia, they had Americans paraded, and it's all the road was guarded by Japanese soldiers with arms. No incident took place. And so this is, Japanese transition from the defeat to occupation was, I would say, very, very relatively very smooth. It's nothing like that what happened in the eastern part of Germany. Yes.
Yes, it was of course very interesting. I'm wondering that the Russians entered the war a few days after Hiroshima bombing. They could have ended the war against the Japanese much earlier because they revoked already in April the deal they had, the neutrality. And do you think there was a link between the Hiroshima bombing and the Russian decision to enter the war?
And I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. That I think Hiroshima. Well, I'm not going to tell you that my juicy climax story because I think this is very, very crucial. I think this is, let me say, to leave you in suspense, it is connected. It was connected. close connection between Hiroshima bomb and the Soviet entry into the war.
Thank you. I'd have two questions. One about the geostrategic calculations of the High Command,
Yes.
which clearly, as you described, as the Soviets approached and entered the game, there was a decision in Tokyo to, in a sense, throw all its chips into the US basket, to have the future of Japan determined by the bilateral relationship between Washington and Tokyo. And obviously, as we know, this will be a structuring feature for Tokyo over the decades to follow. How much of that decision was, as you describe it, fear of the arrival of the Soviets? How much of this was it turning away because there were other actors? There were the Brits, there were the Chinese were in the game as well. How much was it turning to the US? How much was it fleeing the Soviet approach? How much was it Japan trying to stay in the club of powerful nations? And the second question is on the domestic. Here again, you clearly described the opposition between the peace faction and the war faction and how the Koktai issue crystallized the opposition. After the war, the drafting, the first draft, the second draft, and the McCarthy draft of the constitutions will recrystallize these oppositions, especially in the translations as they go back and forth. How much of the voices in Japan are then only the peace faction, or does the war faction, as some historians from outside of Japan claim, was able to recycle itself better than in Germany, the more conservative voices?
Those are two very interesting questions. The Japanese accepted the British. In fact, that the British are more sympathetic to the Japanese than the Americans. In fact, that the British tried to change the Potsdam Stimson draft. British were opposed to the total occupation, the entire occupation, Japanese land occupied by the occupation forces, but the point occupation, and let the Japanese government govern. So that's the British prefer that form. And then this is precisely the kind of and then also the second proposal was to change to whom that ultimatum should be addressed. And then the Americans first says, well, we do not trust all those military government. So we're going to go over the head. We're going to just directly appeal to the Japanese people. And the British says, don't be silly. You have to deal with some government entity, and so that send it to the Japanese government. And the third proposal was to maintain the monarchical system. And here the first and the second amendment were accepted by Burns. In fact, the very interesting thing is that those are the amendments. Those are the ones that more liberal, progressive wing of American policymakers insisted. State Department, for instance, State Department, McLeish, and then also Dean Nixon. Then it was a very radical liberals, and also the China lobby. China lobby is very, very hostile towards Japanese, and so Hornbeck and all those guys. And so they insist those things, and then Burns at first rejected it, and only met with British proposal they accepted it. And so of course the Japanese policymakers are not knowing on the details, But you have to understand the Japanese diplomats and then also military attaché, they were stationed in the various European powers. They were quite familiar with all those British opinion and then also American opinions. And so they were quite familiar with, I mean, how that they can work with American occupation forces to maintain that the imperial house, and then also as far as Chinese are very adamantly Chinese were interested in occupation forces, and it is MacArthur and then also the U.S. government. No Chinese would participate in occupation forces, right? And so that was settled. So that's, I don't know to answer your question, but the Soviets were really interested in participating in occupation forces. In fact, that the two two bodies of occupation, that's Far Eastern Council, and then also there's another council in Washington. The Soviets are part of it, but more important ones are MacArthur's occupation forces, and this MacArthur is the one that ran the show, and totally vetoed all the Soviet insistence. And Soviet did propose that abolition of the emperor, the MacArthur totally rejected. And then the United States, despite all the initial harsh treatment of the emperor system, particularly MacArthur, found it convenient and helpful to maintain emperor system, to have a very smooth occupation policy. In fact, there's a debate within American government, and then who is going to surrender, to sign the surrender documents, right? And some Americans, radicals or liberals, they insisted we should have the emperor come to the on the Missouri to sign the document. In fact, not only Americans, but the American radicals, but also this is the opinion of Australians and New Zealand, because they had a very terrible memory of Japanese. The Japanese, they took a very radical position. It is said that the British government, British government just contained that opposition, and says we are not going to invite the fourth emperor to come to to sign the documents. And then this MacArthur played a very crucial role. Now, second part of the question, I can't remember what it was. The geopolitical.
Whether the war party did not have more influence after the war in the constitutional settlements than the peace party.
Yes. They were, I think, not only war party, but particularly those who are very close to the emperor worked closely with the occupation force, and in many ways the Americans are very weak, when it comes to the monarchical system. And then all the imperial house, princes, or the invite to the imperial palace for duck hunting and that sort of thing. They are so excited, and so they were, there's a concerted effort of the Japanese politicians to bribe the occupation forces to preserve that imperial household, And then it was sort of a it's mutual interest for both occupation forces and then those conservative forces, and therefore that those conservative forces, of course, as you know, trying to insist on the imperial emperor's political role. Of course, this is overruled by MacArthur, and MacArthur imposed the MacArthur's constitution on Japan. It was a shock for the Japanese conservatives, but eventually they come to live with it.
We can take one last question.
Thanks. I just have a more like an anecdotal question. Since yesterday we were talking about this, that the Russians knew about the development of the bomb, but the Americans didn't know whether the Russians knew. I would ask the same about the Japanese. Did they know? And what about the Americans, if they knew about?
I don't think Japanese knew. I mean, Japanese. I don't think Japanese knew that their diplomatic and then military dispatches were intercepted by the Americans. I don't think they did. They changed the code, but the Americans are very efficient in just reading the code. That's my understanding. This is very interesting that you have to, that all the archival sources are now coming out from Soviet Union. It's very interesting to know that whether that there's the Soviet intelligence and an access to the American. But that I could tell you though that Soviet spies working in Washington. They are. It's one very interesting sort of episode I could tell you is this. There's what to do with the curios at the Yalta conference, right? Yalta conference, because the curios are to be handed over to the Soviet Union after Soviet participated in the war. And Truman was okay with it. I mean, I'm sorry, Roosevelt. But there are some Japanese specialists worked on this, and this is, southern part of Curios. That's where the Japanese and Russia are disputing on southern part of Curios. That should belong to the Soviet Union. I mean, to Japan. This is called the Blakesley Memo. And this is very interesting. I just discovered I did not see the document by myself, but the Soviet historian who got access to the Soviet presidential archives said the Blakesley Memo found itself in Stalin's archives. And so Stalin knew, and how it came about, it's anybody's guess, but my guess is that there was a spy working in the State Department, or I think more likely British spy working in the British Foreign Ministry. I think they're feeding information to the Soviet Union. To answer your question, I don't think Japanese knew that their intelligence was eavesdropped.
Did they have any intelligence on the bomb, on the Manhattan Project?
Did Japanese? I don't think they. I think they were. The Japanese had their own atomic bomb project, and the physicist known Nishina, who worked in I can't remember the Rutherford's, Cambridge. And then the military commissioned him to work on an atomic bomb project. The problem was that the uranium, and then they came to the conclusion that there's no way that the Japanese could manufacture to build the bomb. And in fact, that he came to the conclusion that it's enormous task that the atomic bomb will not be created, will not be built. And so that when the atomic bombs dropped in Hiroshima, he was surprised. He was surprised that the Americans could manage to manufacture the bomb, but he immediately knew that it was atomic bomb. And in fact, this is very interesting. There was a uranium committee under the General Staff of Army. They're studying it. And then when the atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, that uranium committee was immediately held. And then the War Minister Anami, who was really was gung-ho about continuation of war, who was really, personally, he was really concerned about the atomic bomb. And so,
thank you very much. So, Professor Hasegawa, build in the suspense. If you really want to know how it all ended, you need to see the Soviet side of it and come back tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much.